All right. Well, welcome everyone. And I'm thankful that it's not an intimidating crowd, but I'm sure that Sydney's going to do an amazing job. So I wanted to share a few things. In my tenure here at Wayne State College, I've been privileged to walk alongside a lot of amazing students on our journey of learning together. But Sydney raises the bar. She's had to navigate a lot of things, not only the rigor of being pre-med RHOP, but also a Division II track athlete. And it's the end of the season, and they don't even have a track out there to practice on. She's volunteered with our ESL program, and not in her biography, she was recently honored with the Ron Holt Civic Engagement Award, which is a huge honor for her service-mindedness and her heart. As you will learn today, she also had to navigate a sudden pivot in her research. But she did it so well, and her work is so outstanding that we're even considering looking at publishing this in a journal. She begins medical school in the fall. So I want to share something personal. Most of you, well, some of you, if you're students, know that I keep dark chocolate in my office. I use it as an apology if I've made a mistake in class and I need to apologize. I use it as a thanks for people that do things that make me happy. And I also sometimes use it as a bribe to bring students to my office to get dark chocolate. But right now, I'm going to give Sydney some special dark chocolate because I'm thankful that she's not only been an amazing student, but she's allowed me to learn alongside with her and from her in her journey of learning. So please welcome Sydney Escritt. And I'll give you the
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here today. My honors research looked at the impacts of funding instability on biomedical research, clinical practice, policy, and health. Before this project became focused on funding instability, it actually started with a very different research question. I was originally involved in a project looking at continuous glucose monitoring or CGM use in individuals with type 2 diabetes. The goal was to better understand the evidence-based benefits of CGM use in type 2 diabetes and to help justify the need for these technologies, especially in underrepresented and rural populations like the one we were working with here. A major part of that project focused on understanding barriers to access and participation, because even when these technologies are effective, that does not necessarily mean that they are equally accessible to all populations. As the study progressed, though, we started encountering challenges with recruitment and continuation of the project. Multiple factors contributed to low participant enrollment, and eventually the original study could not continue the way we had planned. Instead of simply ending the project with the help of the prior principal investigator on the UNMC study, Dr. Leslie Island, and the help of Dr. Ingebretson, we decided to reshift the focus of the project rather than abandon it entirely. That shift became really important. It pushed me to start thinking about the larger systems affecting biomedical research itself. Not just participation in one study, but the broader structural conditions influencing whether research can continue, grow, and translate into healthcare innovation in the first place. That ultimately led to this project towards examining funding instability and its effects on biomedical research, clinical practice, policy, and health. So before getting into the project itself, it's important to understand why NIH funding matters so much in the first place. NIH stands for the National Institutes of Health, and from this point forward, I'll mainly refer to it as NIH. When people hear about NIH funding or federal research budgets, it can sometimes sound distant, administrative, or purely political. But in reality, these funding systems shape nearly every part of modern biomedical science and healthcare innovation. NIH funding supports the foundational science that drives medical discovery. It helps fund laboratories, researchers, trainees, and the infrastructure needed to study disease and develop new treatments. It also supports clinical trials, the process that allows discoveries to move from the lab into actual patient care. Many of the therapies, medications, and technologies used in healthcare today exist because of decades of federally supported biomedical research. Beyond individual discoveries, NIH funding helps sustain the entire research ecosystem. It influences what scientific questions are explored and which innovations move forward. Also, it can influence how quickly research can translate into healthcare improvements for patients and communities. So when funding becomes unstable, the effects extend far beyond a single grant or project. It begins affecting the larger structure of biomedical research itself. To give a more concrete example of what's already happening, a recent study found that between February and August of 2025, about 3.5% of NIH-funded clinical trials lost their funding. This actually affected over 11,000 trials and more than 74,000 participants. And a lot of those weren't just in the planning stages. They were already actively running studies with patients enrolled. That means that funding changes don't just slow things down in theory. They can actually interrupt research that's already in progress. There's also an equity piece to this. Another study pointed out that minority populations are already underrepresented in clinical trials. Cuts or instability in funding can make that even harder to fix. Overall, it's not just about fewer studies happening. It also affects who gets included in research and who ends up benefiting from the new treatments. Even though there's a lot of strong research showing the impacts of NIH funding cuts on things like innovation, clinical trials, and overall health outcomes, most of that work looks at the system from a really high level. A lot of it is based on projections, economic modeling, or big picture policy outcomes, like how many trials might be affected or what the long-term costs could be. But what's still missing is the lived experience side of it. We don't really have as much understanding of what this uncertainty looks like on people who are actually working inside the system every day, people like researchers, clinicians, and policy professionals. Specifically, we don't fully know how funding instability is influencing day-to-day decisions, like how research gets designed, how careers are shaped, or how institutions adjust behind the scenes to keep things running. We also don't have a clear picture of whether and how this instability might be reinforcing existing inequities in research participation and access to care. So overall, there's a gap between what we know at the system level and what's actually happening in real time with the people doing the work. To address this gap, the study uses a qualitative semi-structured interview design. The goal was to understand how professionals experience and respond to NIH funding instability in real time. More importantly, how that instability carries throughout the system, affecting biomedical innovation, shaping this clinical practice, influencing patient care, and ultimately impacting the health outcomes. Instead of focusing only on funding levels or projections, the study centers the lived experiences of the people actually working inside these systems every day. For the methods, this was a qualitative exploratory study. I used semi-structured interviews so participants could describe their experience in their own words rather than being limited to fixed responses. I also used a narrative approach, which helped focus on how people make sense of funding instability in the context of their own work and career. In total, I interviewed 10 participants across different sectors, including research, clinical practice, public health, and policy. All IRB requirements were followed, and the study received approval through Wayne State College prior to any data collection. The goal was to get a range of perspectives across the biomedical system, not just from one type of role or setting. For data collection, all of the interviews were done virtually and lasted about 30 minutes. I used open-ended questions so participants could really talk through their experiences in their own words. For the analysis, I started by coding the transcripts for patterns that kept coming up across the interviews. Then I refined those codes into broader themes as I compared the responses between the participants. I also paid attention to career stage and job role when looking at the data. That perspective was included in all of the themes. Sometimes people had really similar experiences, but other times their perspectives looked pretty different depending on where they were in their career and what type of work they did. Overall, the goal was to stay close to what participants were actually saying while still pulling out the bigger patterns across the data set. Before getting into the main interview questions, participants were first asked some basic demographic and background questions so I could better understand their professional role, career stage, and experience within the biomedical system. From there, the interviews moved into more open discussion questions like the two examples shown here. The first one focused on how funding uncertainty may affect communities, patients, and public health programs in the short term. Another question asked how continued instability could influence the career decisions of students and early career professionals entering the field. One of the most important takeaways from the interviews were that participants didn't describe funding instability as something temporary or tied to specific moments. Instead, it was talked about as a constant condition, something that's always present in the background and actively shaping how the system functions. Across all participants, regardless of profession or career stage, there was a shared experience of navigating funding uncertainty in some form. From there, 5 interrelated themes were identified, which I'm going to walk through next. The first theme examines structural dependence on the biomedical research system on federal funding. Across participants, NIH and other federal agencies were described as the backbone of the system, not just funding individual projects, but holding together the workforce, the institutions, and the ability to keep research going over time. One participant put it simply, funding is essential to the infrastructure of biomedical research institutions. What really stood out is how much this funding is tied into people's actual jobs. For many researchers, a large portion of their salary, anywhere from about 30 to 75%, comes from grants. So their job security is directly connected to whether or not they can continuously secure their funding. Participants also made an important distinction. It's not only whether funding exists, but how predictable it is. Even when grants are awarded, delays and uncertainties still create problems. One researcher said, funds may show up months after the project has already started. Overall, this theme shows that the system doesn't just rely on federal funding, it runs on it, and even small delays or unpredictability can ripple through everything. The second theme really focuses on the workforce. One of the clearest findings was that funding instability isn't experienced the same way by everyone. Instead, it depends a lot on where someone is in their career and how dependent they are on grant funding. For early career researchers, this uncertainty felt really personal. Even before anything was directly lost, it shaped how they saw their careers. One participant put it simply, people want stability, and this doesn't always feel like a stable job. Because of that, early career participants described constantly adjusting their research plans just to make sure their work felt safer in terms of funding. One person said, we had to pivot our aims to keep the project safe. A lot of them also talked about regularly thinking about backup career options, just in case research didn't work out long term. For mid-career researchers, who are often the ones actually running and managing these labs, the focus shifted more to the stability of their teams day to day. Labs were often described almost like small businesses that depend on funding just to function. One participant said, research labs are small businesses and people's livelihoods depend on that funding. They talked about hiring freezes, staff layoffs, and the difficulty of keeping research teams stable when funding is constantly uncertain. Even senior or tenured faculty weren't fully protected from this. Their salary and lab support still depended heavily on grants. At the leadership level, participants discussed concerns for what this means for the system as a whole, especially workforce loss over time and what happens when people leave research altogether. One participant captured that concern directly. Once people leave academic research, they don't really come back. Overall, this theme shows that funding instability doesn't affect just projects, it shapes whether people stay in the research field at all. To summarize this theme, funding instability looks different depending on career stage. For early career researchers, it shows job insecurity and uncertainty about staying in academic research, often leading to thoughts about career shifts. For mid-career researchers, who are often managing and running the labs, it's more about lab stability and workforce strain as they try to keep teams functioning. And for senior leaders, it becomes a system-level concern about the long-term effects on the biomedical workforce and infrastructure. In this theme, participants described a clear shift in how research is actually being conducted under funding instability. First, there's a shift towards what people call safer research. Instead of taking on bold or exploratory projects, researchers are increasingly choosing work that feels more likely to be funded or approved. That connects directly to a second point, which is a reduction in high-risk innovation. A lot of participants describe that the kinds of breakthrough, long-term projects that drive big scientific advances are becoming harder to justify or sustain because they come with too much uncertainty. On top of that, there's a growing administrative burden. Researchers are spending more and more time managing uncertainty, reworking grant applications, tracking shifting priorities, and trying to maintain funding continuity just to keep their labs running. One participant summed it up really well when they said it feels like a hamster wheel of constantly searching for funding. The second part of this theme focused on how institutions are trying to respond to all of this uncertainty. Participants described a few common buffering strategies. One is bridge funding, which is basically short-term institutional support to keep projects or personnel growing when grants are delayed or fall through. Another is diversifying funding portfolios, meaning institutions are trying to pull from multiple sources instead of relying so heavily on federal funding alone. There's also been a noticeable increase in reliance on clinical revenue and industry partnerships to help offset these gaps in federal support. In some ways, that raises the question of where the financial burden starts shifting, whether more pressure eventually falls on healthcare systems, insurance structures, or even patients themselves. Overall, participants don't describe these as long-term solutions. Instead, they were seen more as reactive strategies, ways to stabilize the system in the moment rather than truly fixing the underlying instability. The next theme moves into what this looks like downstream, once we start looking at patient care and population health. One of the clearest effects participants described was delayed translation, meaning it takes longer for discoveries in the lab to actually make it into clinical practice. As one clinical participant put it, it slows how quickly we bring these new therapies to patients. From there, this shows up in a few connected ways. Participants talked about disrupted clinical trials, especially when funding stops or becomes unstable mid-study. They also described a reduced capacity for prevention-focused research and programs, which tends to get deprioritized when resources are limited. Over time, this contributes to a higher burden of chronic disease at the population level, because prevention and early intervention efforts are weakened. What stood out in the interviews is that these effects are not always immediate or visible. One participant said, "You might not see the effects now, but you will, whether it's you or your children." The second part of this theme zooms out to the broader system level and equity impacts. One important point participants raised is that many of these issues already exist in the healthcare system, but funding instability tends to make them worse. And that effect is even more significant in the context of misinformation and already limited trust in biomedical science. From there, we start to see real-world impacts on care delivery, things like disruption in access to essential services, including medications, maternal care, and crisis services. Participants also described an erosion of trust, both in clinical systems and in community partnerships that are essential for delivering care. Overall, these effects don't impact everyone equally. They tend to increase vulnerability in underserved and rural populations, who are already facing the most barriers in the system. The final theme pulls everything together and focuses on how the system starts to reinforce itself over time. Participants described a kind of cycle where funding instability leads to reduced research activity, which then weakens workforce stability and over time lowers overall system capacity. As capacity drops, the instability itself actually becomes worse. One policy level participant captured the feeling of this shift really clearly, saying we're stuck being reactive instead of strategic. At the individual level, this also showed up in career decisions. Some participants described having to step away from academic research or shift paths entirely just to find more stability. As one physician scientist put it, "I had to choose an option that has more stability." To summarize the key findings from this study, one of the most important takeaways is that funding instability may actually be more damaging than direct funding cuts alone. A lot of the effects participants described happened before any actual loss of funding occurs. Just the uncertainty itself started to shape the behavior. We saw that funding uncertainty influences how people make decisions day to day. It changes research choices, it affects our career planning, and it impacts whether people stay in certain roles at all. Over time, this also affects the overall stability and sustainability of the biomedical research system. So rather than being something that only matters when budgets are officially reduced, uncertainty itself is already actively reshaping the system. When we step back and interpret the findings, funding instability is not just a financial issue. Instead, it functions as a structural force that actually shapes how the entire biomedical system operates. It influences what kinds of research get done, how the workforce is trained and retained, and how institutions organize and sustain themselves, and ultimately, how health outcomes are affected. So what do these changes mean for equity in marginalized populations? One of the main effects is delayed translation of research into actual patient care, meaning it takes longer for new discoveries to reach the people who need them. There's also a reduction in prevention-focused research for chronic diseases, which is especially important for conditions that already disproportionately affect underserved communities. Participants also described disruptions in community and global health programs, along with weakened institutional partnerships in areas that rely heavily on sustained collaboration. When you put all of this together, the concern is that existing healthcare disparities don't just stay the same, they actually may worsen over time. So overall, funding instability doesn't impact all populations equally. It tends to disproportionately affect communities that are already facing structural barriers in access and outcome. This slide looks at what's driving these issues and what the consequences are for policy. On the causes side, participants pointed to growing instability in federal research funding, a disconnect between policymakers and what research actually looks like day to day, and a limited understanding of how long scientific progress really takes. There's also an increase in public mistrust in both science and policy systems. On the consequences side, this tends to lead to more short-term policy decisions instead of long-term planning. It reduces support for research that takes years to develop, and it can slow down clinical innovation and public health progress. Over time, this also affects how well research actually translates into patient care and can create long-term risks for overall population health. Funding instability doesn't just affect scientists or institutions. It directly affects the development of new treatments and ultimately influences healthcare outcomes for everyone. The impact doesn't stop inside research labs. It extends into hospitals, clinics, communities, and shapes the care that people actually receive. This connects to a bigger issue around public understanding and trust. One of the challenges is that a lot of this conversation is very technical or policy-driven, so it doesn't always reach the public in an accessible way. Improving public health literacy around this topic is really important. That may require more clear evidence on long-term health and economic impacts, then translating that information in a way that people can actually understand and connect with. Overall, this matters because it affects both the science and the people it's meant to serve. Trust plays a key role in that connection. Some final takeaways are that funding instability is really a system level factor that shapes how biomedical science functions overall. It influences the direction of innovation. It affects the healthcare workforce and the resources available to them, and ultimately it impacts public health and equity. The main takeaways is that it isn't just a funding issue. It's something that shapes the entire system from research all the way to patient care. I wanted to end with this idea because it connects everything from the project together. Federal investment in biomedical and clinical science doesn't stop at research itself. It translates into health equity outcomes, public trust in science and medicine, and ultimately health equity. Throughout these interviews, that connection kept coming up again and again. That research funding is not isolated from the rest of society. It influences the treatments we develop, the systems we build, and the populations we are able to reach. Participants consistently described it as an investment with broad and long-term returns. Lastly, I just want to thank everyone who has helped me complete this project. This project would not have been possible without the insight, time, and expertise of the professionals who participated in this study. Their perspectives, leadership, and dedication to advancing biomedical science and healthcare made this research possible. So thank you, Dr. Leslie Island and Dr. Ingebrigtsen, for your mentorship and guidance and continued support throughout this project. Anyone has any questions?